Hello and welcome to In the Light. I'm Anna Isabel and I am an astrologer and also an analytical hypnotherapist. But today I have with me somebody that I was really looking forward to speaking to, and her name is Felicity Warner, who is a soul midwife. Felicity, welcome to In the Light.
Oh, thank you so much, Anna, for inviting me to take part. I'm looking forward to it.
I guess the best thing to do first would be to explain what is a soul midwife.
Oh, well, that's a good question. And I teach many pupils about being a soul midwife, and I get them to practice the definition. And so the short version is that a soul midwife is a holistic and spiritual companion to the dying and their families. So that just gives it to you in the simplest terms, but we also work from point of diagnosis when someone has recently had bad news about their health, all the way through that journey, right through until the point of death, when we may be vigiling, and a little short time after that as well.
And you work with the individual as well as the family?
Yes, very much so. I mean, our primary focus is working with the individual who is facing end of life. But as we all know, we all have loved ones and friends and families, or hopefully most of us do. So we also hold them in our caring embrace as well.
Do you work individually or do you have a team working with you?
Okay, we tend to work individually because this work is so deep, and it's very one-to-one, and so the sort of relationship that we have with our dying friend, we call them friends, not patients and not clients, is very intimate. So it's really mainly a one-to-one relationship. And that's really how it works.
Your books are so helpful, and I think there's, I guess, something that I ought to mention. Two things. Firstly, is that your books. I think one of them is A Safe Journey Home. But I know that they have lent them to people who were going through the process of potentially losing someone, and and I've given them away as well, just to help them understand the process of death. And I think that's something that we are very divorced from. And it's one thing when it's a sudden death, but when it's not, then you're actually witnessing the process itself and the different stages. And it might be helpful if perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I'd be very happy to. This understanding that death is a process rather than an event is really one of the basics in soul midwifery now, and it forms the diagnostic basis of all that we do therapeutically. So just to explain it simply, as you say, we see death as a process, and that is it rolls out in a series of 4 stages. And these stages can take quite a long time to work through, depending on the illness itself. But if we were looking at classic old age, for instance, where there may be several diseases at play, but just old age, where somebody is gradually just getting slower and slower, we could break it down like this. We would say the first stage is the earth stage. The earth relates to our bones and our vitality. Gradually that will ebb away, and the person will become weaker, more tired, less active in their lives. The next stage will be the water stage, and water corresponds hugely with the psyche, with the deep memories of life. It's nostalgic, it's about reminiscing. It's a time when a lot of memories from life come up to the surface to be looked at, to be addressed, to be resolved, and then released gently. So that's the water stage. The next stage, which really bursts in with a big energy of its own, is the fire stage. And we see that much closer towards the end of life, when people become really quite full of angst, and they may be very restless, they have terminal agitation. And we see that stage as something akin to the dark night of the soul. It's a really tough phase to go through. It doesn't last very long, maybe 3 or 4 days at the most, but a lot more releasing goes on at that stage. It's also when people seem to rally and get a little bit more energy, and sometimes relatives say, oh, maybe they've turned the corner, maybe they're actually going to start getting better. But sadly, it's quite short-lived, and before long they slip into the next stage, which is the air stage. And the air stage is very connected with the breath. We come in on a breath and we go out on a breath, and the breathing becomes very changed in those last hours of life. So the air stage is the last stage to go. So when we can understand dying in terms of looking at these stages, it gives us such a good framework for being really able to see how best we can help the dying person, because each stage will bring its potential for various therapeutic offerings, ranging from help with breathing, with mindfulness, working with certain essential oils, working with sound, with touch. These are all the tools that we use to really give the person who is at end of life deep loving care, real tender loving care. And that's what our work is all about. And it's all about really helping to alleviate pain and anxiety, and to help people to really find a place of peace and grace and serenity.
Just listening to you, the question that came to mind was, these different stages, are they consecutive or can they overlap?
It's not a precise sort of science, the dying process, but usually these stages are consecutive. But in some diseases such as dementia, we sometimes have a sort of a wavering between two stages, and that can also happen with the effects of some medication as well. But generally speaking, these phases are the standard phases that we would recognize. So it is so helpful to know and to understand and to be able to observe them is a great help, certainly.
It occurred to me to ask the question because I felt that Dad, as he was going through the process, which took years, that there was an overlap sometimes from one stage to another. It wasn't a clean change. It was a little bit of wavering. And you were talking about people with dementia. He didn't have dementia. He had Parkinson's. But that did affect his mind at different points. So the agitation was something I really recognized. And it was there much more in the last. It was there as part of the illness for a number of years, but it became much more pronounced in the last year. And it, it wasn't a matter of weeks.
It was a really, really good comments, Anna, and really good questions. It's these stages of dying. Now, this is a concept to think about a minute, in that we're all constantly in transition. It may not mean that we're about to die, but from day to day, we are in transition between various phases energetically. And so we go through these phases or replicas of them at all times during our life. And if you're with a group of soul midwives, for instance, because we're so familiar with these phases, we may often say to each other, oh, I'm in water today, or oh, I've been a bit fiery this week. We know and understand that language because it's kind of the flavor of where we're at the moment. But while we're well and we're alive and we're not actually very actively dying, we go in and out of these phases all the time. It's only in the actual dying process, which will be at the very, very end of life, that these elements withdraw from the body from the final time, for the final time. So it would be very normal for somebody in the last few years of life to be exhibiting some of these symptoms, but they're not actually in the active stage yet. Does that make any sense?
Of course, it makes complete sense. And I'm actually just curious as to how you came about labeling them with the elements, because of course this is something that as an astrologer I'm extremely familiar with.
Well, of course, there is a correlation there. I hadn't really thought of that. What happened for me was that I had spent a lot of time working with dying people and sitting at the bedside. I was within clinical environments. I was actually volunteering in a hospice, but many hours a week. I also sat there with some clinical knowledge, but my main interest was aroused because I'm also an energy healer, and I actually see energy. And that gives me a sort of an advantage at times of being able to sit and observe things that are on a fairly subtle level. And I could see from sitting with many people that died how there were huge similarities at certain stages of their dying journey. And I became like a sort of boffin professor, wanting to get to know what all this was about, because it wasn't written about in medical textbooks at all. And I could see there was a correlation not only in their physical state, but within their psycho-spiritual state. And this is where I really became engrossed in the micro of what I was seeing, as well as the sort of macro experience. I did a lot of field work on this, probably over 15 years or so, in quite a lot of depth, before coming up with the model itself. And I looked at many other medical paradigms for help and understanding. I looked at traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine. And I think what really struck me, and really I got green lights blazing at me when I looked at Tibetan medicine, which really seemed to be giving signposts to these phases that I was seeing. So within the Buddhist tradition as well, these phases are noted, but not really within a clinical expression, more as a sort of spiritual expression. But once I started working with them, I began to create this model and this matrix. And the joy of it for me now is that it works for us very well in terms of how we understand how we can help people at certain stages. But I love teaching this to doctors and nurses as well, because they'll often think, I wonder what this is going to be about. But when I actually start teaching it, so many of them will say, oh yes, we do understand this, we do know this, but we haven't got a language for it, and it hasn't been described in sort of Western medicine. So there's a complete joy here of being able to introduce a model that helps them as well, especially with the psychospiritual approach to looking after dying people?
One of the reasons why I created this podcast was because I wanted something that didn't exclusively treat mental health as being physical or emotional only. Because from my work as a therapist, I have learned what I already instinctively knew, is that healing needs to involve the spiritual. Without that component, there is never truly healing. It then becomes a much longer process of healing. And I have heard so many therapists talk about the role of belief and the role of faith in the process of healing. And so it seems to me the most logical thing that if you're helping somebody in the process of dying, that you need to address the spiritual issue. So it's a wonderful thing to hear you talk in a very, well, holistic way about the approach to helping people who are in the process of dying.
Oh, well, thank you, Anna. That's lovely to hear. I mean, this is taking me into territory that I am so passionate about. I think that I come from an underlying view, I suppose, that dying is an extraordinary event, and most people don't realize the potential it brings for so much. You know, the journey is a rich journey if someone is really well supported, not only physically but spiritually. They potentially can really, they can learn so much about themselves, they can have realizations, they can do a lot of soul growth in that actual process of dying. And it's a fascinating thing that I've seen time and time and time again, is that when people are dying, when their physical body is diminishing, their strength is diminishing, and their body isn't holding their spirit as strongly as it once did, then there's a switch of dynamic where the spiritual side of people then starts to blossom. So the spiritual body's deteriorating, but there is this inner blossoming, a sort of quickening, if you like. And I'm always so aware when I'm working with someone when this is about to happen. You can feel the energy in that person change, and they start to focus a lot more on, you know, the meaning of life, the meaning of who they were. It becomes much more of an existential sort of journey. Not for everybody, certainly not, but for a lot of people, on some level, that will happen. So I think you're so right, and I would agree with you completely about healing. When we're talking of healing people, it's never just the actual body. There has to be recognition and embrace of the deeper part of themselves as well. Absolutely.
How do you approach someone who is an atheist or who is convinced that there is no afterlife?
Oh, I work with many, many, many people who have absolutely no belief system at all, no need for any belief system. It just might be something that they are vehemently adamant about, or something that they've just arrived at, and it isn't for them. That doesn't make any difference to me at all when I'm working with them, because I'm led absolutely by the place where that person is at that time. So if they have no spiritual interest, then we don't even need to go there. We don't even mention it. But as I was saying in that last question, it's so interesting that when people are halfway through that journey, they will start sometimes to say, oh, I had an interesting dream last night. I dreamt that, you know, I had a sort of semi-mystical experience. you know, it just left me thinking, you know, I hadn't thought of such and such. That may well be the sort of question then that leads into a conversation, which may then lead into something else. It's just, you know, it really doesn't matter. The big thing is working with whoever it is at the point of need that they have. So having a spiritual agenda is absolutely not on my agenda. We just see what happens and let things unravel as they will or not.
And of course, that is very important. I have the same approach myself. I work with my clients wherever they present themselves on this scale of spirituality.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important that that's done, because it's about honoring the person wherever they're at. But I think also just the process of coming to terms with life and with the emotional landscape as it presents itself towards the end is in itself a very spiritual experience, whether we call it that or not. It's making peace within ourselves and with those around us.
Absolutely. And we will all do that in our own individual way. You know, it will mean different things to different people. That. So I really see part of my role is to enable, in a sense, or to hold space for somebody to be doing their own self-witnessing. Holding space is this phrase we use so much in soul midwifery, but it's just allowing and just embracing what needs to come out without any kind of need for a specific outcome. It just is what it is. And I think this concept of witnessing is a very powerful one for people who, you know, in these days, a lot of people don't do a lot of reflective work on themselves throughout life. I think as therapists, we tend to. It's part of what we do. But I'm struck by how many people haven't really devoted much time to that inner conversation with themselves. And again, during the dying process, I think that does, you know, that there are sort of promptings for people to be doing that. So supporting that inner dialogue and narrative is just so important, and so much part of the support that we can give. So there's a lot more to soul midwifery than checking someone's cat's being fed, which we of course we do as well, or sitting at the bedside holding a hand, which actually can be one of the best things that we do. But it's also having this understanding about the depth and the more complex inner parts of the journey towards death.
Bearing witness is, I think, highly undervalued by those who find it difficult to witness pain, which is understandable, because what we want is we want to take away the pain, we don't want to take away the suffering, make it go away really quickly. And sometimes that's just not possible, but it cannot, I don't think, be underestimated. It must not be underestimated, the value of just bearing witness to some experiences, because when you do that, it means that they're not having to go through it alone. And that, I think, is absolutely one of the most important things that we can do, is to say, when you are at your most vulnerable, when you are at your weakest, when you are in pain, I will hold you.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, I couldn't agree more. And you know, this is the space that we inhabit with another, certainly. And I find the poignancy of meeting someone at that place, it's so intense. Something I realized early on, and it always sort of hurt my heart, but made my heart sort of grow as well was the fact that so many people have never been properly listened to. And that might sound a bit glib, but you know, when you sit in a space with someone and you're witnessing and you're listening, there is a huge energetic shift in that. And so many people have never ever been given, haven't been valued enough by another person in order to experience what that feels like. And it may be they're only getting it as they're dying. And that always feels so sad to me that they went through life and nobody really took that interest in them to hear that inner voice. And that always leaves me feeling, sort of sad, but you can feel the effect when you've been able to do that for someone, to witness and to hold space and to deeply listen to them. It's as if often the person is saying, thank goodness somebody did that for me once. But isn't that sad that we don't do that for each other when we're alive and well?
Yes, indeed. And I think, you know, many of us do and many of us don't. It's a question of how comfortable we are with our own feelings, as to whether or not we're able to extend ourselves when somebody else is in a crisis. So I think that's the reality, is that we're all on this journey in which we have the relationship with ourselves, which then informs the relationship we have with others. And part of that is how we deal with feeling. And some of us find that very, very hard and would rather run away from it all. The question of being at peace, you know, something that I think I learned from you was and then it was kind of brought into sharp focus for me last year as my father was dying. So and of course, you work with the families. You don't just work with the individual. And I think one of the things I find as a therapist, I'll get to the point in a minute.
You're doing well, just take your time.
One of the things that I find as a therapist is that there's complicated grief and there is simple grief. Simple grief is purely the pain of missing the person you love not being there.
Yeah.
Complex grief is the grief that is full of recrimination, full of guilt, and for what could have been, what might have been, anger. You know, that's very complicated because things have not been sorted out. And one of the things that I really valued about your work from the start was the fact that you work with the whole family. And now comes the bit that you really crystallized for me, was the value of talking to the person even as they lay dying, or being with the person. And I think that really came home to me last year, because in the middle of the crisis that we were all facing, my father was dying in another country. And you know, that was, and of course it's not exclusive. He happened to be in another country, but I have friends who lost loved ones last year, who were in exactly the same position, denied access.
Yes.
My beloved relative. And you know, this is, so what I did, and this is, I have a huge debt of gratitude to you. Understanding the value, knowing I could not be there physically, I asked Dad's carer to put the tablet next to his bed. And I couldn't touch him, but I could talk to him. And the eye movements were registering recognition. And the 3 day, he took 5 days to pass. And 3 of those days at the start, allowing for the time difference between us, different time zones, I was there the whole time.
Wow.
And that time, at first it was memories, just sharing memories, things that I remembered that we did together.
Mm-hmm.
Then I was thinking about preparing him for passing. And so I was telling him metaphorical tales of heroes going on journeys.
Wonderful.
So I was doing that for about 3 days. And I also galvanized things so that my brother and sister, who were in the same position as I was in, had the same opportunity. And I was determined that this would be the case, because I did not want any of us to, after he passed, be plagued by the pain of not having been able to say our. So I owe you a huge debt of gratitude, because it's thanks to what I learned from you that I do what I did. And I learned a great deal from it, not least of which the process of doing that was as important for me as it was for Dad, because in that time I processed our relationship and what it meant to me.
Oh, beautiful. Well, goodness me, Anna, I'm so touched to hear that. I really am. And you will never know how much difference that made to your father as well, because one of the big things is, and again, so many people don't realize this, that hearing is the last sense to go. And so even when somebody is not verbal anymore and they're not really registering very much, it is really, really believed that hearing is the last sense to go. And so being able to talk to your loved one in the way you did, I'm so touched by the way that you shared your memories. I thought that was beautiful. And then using these metaphorical tales is just so inspiring, and I have this sense for him listening. It must have been empowering and very comforting as well. And not only did you do that, but you also encouraged your siblings to have a part and to spend time doing that too, albeit at a distance. This is absolutely pure soul midwifery. We're going to have to give you a badge saying that you are a soul midwife at heart, because what you did there was just beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I really I think you did a wonderful job there. I absolutely do. And with this whole COVID thing, this has been a story that I have heard other people have shared with me. And I'm so interested in what you finished by saying, which was how it gave you an opportunity to process your own relationship with your father. And I'm guessing here, but may I suggest that helped your grieving process as well, do you think?
Completely. And that's why I brought it up, because it's something that I knew in my head, but I experienced it. And when I experienced it, I knew it, of course, in my heart. And that's why because I knew it in my head, I was adamant that my brother and sister must have the same opportunity, because I did not want them to be in a situation where they felt cut off, and it made the grief process harder for them. Because I that happening to so many of my clients. So I understood that. I knew it intellectually, but then whilst I was doing it, it was just this natural thing. And it meant that when Dad passed, there was nothing complicated. I just miss him. And of course I miss him hugely. And I get very emotional when I think about it, and I get very emotional when I see pictures of him. And go, because that's just the missing. But what was wonderful was the fact that I could feel at peace. And it's interesting. I said to you that it was the first 3 days, but it took 5 days to pass. Well, let's say 4.5.
Mm-hmm.
And I instinctively knew on the 4th that it was time for me to stop, because I needed to let him go, and I needed him to feel free to go.
Yes.
And
yes.
what was wonderful was that the palliative care nurse who was coming in and checking on him actually said to my mum, on the day before, she said, it could be that it's time for him to just be quiet now. So she had the same sense at the same time as I did. So I felt, that's good. I know what I need to do. So yes, you're absolutely right. It helps with the grief, the grieving. I don't have a complicated bereavement here. I miss my dad.
Yes.
But that's all. And thank goodness. Thank goodness. Thank you. So thank you.
Oh, bless you. As I say, I'm just so moved to hear this. And this will strike a chord in so many other people. I also have a personal story myself from last year. I also lost my dad. It was very hard because he didn't die of COVID, but he went into hospital just for the last 12 hours of his life. And it was very rushed and very sudden, and we weren't able to visit him. We weren't able to talk to him. It was very, very difficult. With all the years of work that I've done supporting dying people, it was such an irony that I couldn't actually support my own father. And so that was complicated. But what I did do was, as soon as I heard he had died, he died at 3 a.m. He'd only gone into hospital after lunch the day before, and he died at 3 a.m. and I was told about an hour later. And I actually went into a deep state of meditation, and I just worked with him from that point onwards. And I was in such a deep space for about 4 or 5 hours, talking to him, telling him all the things that I wanted to say and would have said if I'd been able to actually physically talk to him. It was the most extraordinary connection, really, I think I'd ever had with him. And it did take me a long time. And I lit a candle and I just sat, and I felt I was with him. And it helped me enormously, because at the end of that, as I came out of that, and I felt that I had in fact had the chance to give of myself and to help him, however strange that might sound. But there was such a sense that we had this connection, because he'd only so recently actually died, that he was still, a part of him was still sort of connected. And it was an extraordinary thing that I learned so much from as well. And I have done work with people since who weren't able to do actual bedside work, and we've sort of gone through the death again in order to put it right. We've healed the actual experience by doing similar work. So it shows us, doesn't it, that if we follow our gut instinct and we listen to our own hearts, and we dare to do things slightly differently, then really our own souls know how to help us through these losses. And I think there's so much that we can all be doing to help each other again with this aspect of death. It's a huge area that we can be helping people with, that's for sure.
And we will continue to learn and develop. So I just want to thank you again for being with us today on In the Light. And if people would like to get in touch with you, how could they do that?
Oh, yes, I love to hear from people. So I have a website, which is www.soulmidwives.co.uk. If you log on to that, you can see all sorts of things about the work I do, but also it'll show you how you can email me if you'd like to. And I love hearing from people. I run courses on how to do this work, and I would just love to hear from anybody who's got something to say or something to share. And God bless you, Annabelle. Anna, sorry, you've been so brilliant with this. It's been very interesting talking to you.
Well, I am going to make sure that a link to your website, as well as your books, is on the notes accompanying the podcast. And on there as well, people will be interested to see a link to the YouTube interview that we did yesterday, Felicity and I, looking at Felicity's charts, so you can get a better understanding of her journey, and how she got to where she is. Felicity, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much as well. Thank you.
You've been listening to In the Light with me, Anna Isabel. Next week, I'm not sure just yet who is going to be sitting with me, but whoever it is, I'm sure that you will enjoy. So make sure you tune in.